Welcome everyone to Addressing Inequities Through Climate Change. We're happy to have you all here this afternoon. Hope you still have some energy left after all the talks we had this morning. This morning, Mustafa Ali left us with a message that we can make a difference in climate change if we anchor it in people's lives. And that's what this discussion is about. We're hoping to come together this afternoon to share our collective expertise and wisdom to address the challenges of advancing a just transition through our work at our universities. There's a great deal of knowledge in this room, both on stage and out with you all, and we're hoping with that collective knowledge that we can use that so that, as Mustafa Ali said this morning, since we know better, we can do better. And with a collective knowing, there's much greater chance of doing great things. So we'll begin today, and I think I do need to slip on one. There. The agenda for today includes group discussion, as we said. So you'll hear from a distinguished panel here from the Democracy Collaborative, Northeastern University, and Harvard. And they'll all talk about their, just helping you define what a just transition is. That'll be followed by a group discussion so that you can more clearly define it for your own institution. What does it mean in your community to have a just transition? We'll come back together for another panel to really get into the how. So the first one's sort of what is this? The next one is how. So what are some of the frameworks? What are the things you can do? And then you'll break back into sessions to really focus on a particular issue across roles to help do some action planning. And the end result is we hope you leave with at least a few steps you can take at your institution to begin this work. So with any other questions, I'm gonna head down.
Hi all, thank you so much for coming to this. We're really excited to share the next couple of hours with you. And we wanted to talk about the just transition and how anchor institutions like higher education can really be key in that mission. I think what we've heard a lot today already is that what we need is a political, economic, social, and technological transition. And in order for that to really center on justice, it means kind of shifting some of our mechanisms and how we're engaging with the community around us. And at this moment, I think one thing I wanted to consider is kind of the privilege that we have to be up here and talking with you right now. Oh, it's already changing without. Well, we'll just, there we go. We are in a privileged position to come and talk to you today, and for all of us to be here. I think communities already know a lot of what they need in terms of a just transition and resilience. I will say that I'm a white woman, and so as we continue this work, it's also important to think about the communities that aren't able to be in the room as we move forward. So to start off the conversation, I just wanted to show this quick graph, which shows wealth inequality in the United States. This is an ongoing trend where we're seeing the top 1%, because of our political economy, is able to accrue more wealth than the bottom 50% of the United States. And this goes very much on racial lines as well. White families are able to accumulate wealth 8 times as much as black families and 10 times as much as Latinx families. And this is an increasing trend. So I think it's like 2052, in which black families, according to these trends, will not be accumulating wealth. It will be 0. And then we have to overlay this with climate change. As this particular researcher showed, climate change could be, if we go business as usual, one of the largest transfers of wealth from poor to rich in the country's history. In this, you can see economic damage as it was described by these researchers. And in the often predominantly communities of color and lower income states are seeing the biggest transfers of wealth out of their states. And this isn't only just happening at like a county or state level, this is happening in the city as well. I was talking to someone after the most recent hurricanes in Houston, and it was really interesting to see kind of what David Hall was describing in the last panel, where there are islands all across the United States where this is happening. And they said there are so many levels of unfairness. The lack of investment by the city over time rendered Northeast Houston more vulnerable to these flooding events. You live near an oil refinery, so your health is degraded, so you can't work as much, so your house is poorly maintained, making damages even worse when you have a flooding event. Then FEMA says you're ineligible for money because they're not going to take care of pre-existing damages. That is the stack of complete inequity of climate and infrastructure together. And so, sorry about that. One of the things that I wanted to do as we're talking is kind of open up the discussion here to kind of talk about what a just transition actually means and kind of the historical background. And I wonder, Vonda, if you would be willing to kind of speak to that a little bit of what a just transition actually means.
Sure. So I'm going to just give a little history of the term just transition. I guess first, can I ask how many people have heard of the just transition? Oh, all right. Unusual that I had so many hands raised. That's great. So in the 1990s, a labor leader in New Jersey, Tony Mazzocchi, who is the president of the Atomic Oil and Chemical Workers Union, he was also a labor leader that worked with Karen Silkwood, for people who've seen the movie Silkwood with Meryl Streep, and you know the story, to look at the what was happening in the factory where she worked. So he was someone who was trying to understand the environmental impacts on workers. So in the 1990s, fast forward, in New Jersey, there was a plant that was set to be closed that the government environmental groups were putting pressure to the company. It was closed, and Tony made the case that the workers there should have a Superfund, kind of modeling it after the Superfund sites. He said that if dirt gets a Superfund, then workers should get a Superfund too. Really with the idea that there should be some justice done by those who are being forced out of their jobs, and that included things like retraining, early retirements, and just a package that would help with the transition. So that's where we first heard the term. And then after that, a lot of work has happened inside of the labor movement to really look at how does it not become a set of, or actually how does it not become a contest between the environment and workers? Why does one have to be pitted against the other? And so you've seen lots of efforts take place globally by trade unions to really think about what the transition would look like, including a lot of work to get the term just transition into the Paris Accord. So the Paris Agreement says government should take into account the imperatives of a just transition of the workforce and the creation of decent work and quality jobs. And so that term has been expanded really over the last, I would say, 5 or 10 years to also include communities. And so groups like Climate Justice Alliance have now taken sort of another kind of systems approach to a just transition by saying that what it is a set of principles and practices that build economic and political power to shift from an extractive economy to a regenerative economy. And so when I talk about the just transition with folks, in a nutshell, I usually say, as we work to decarbonize our economy, as Jeremy Grantham said this morning, it's going to take us too long, but it's going to happen. What is going to happen to the communities and workers as we make that transition? And if there's justice for those workers and communities, that's really captured by this term.
Thank you so much. And I'm wondering, Emily, if you would mind giving us a little bit more background on how anchor institutions and universities and higher education come into this context of a just transition.
Yeah, first of all, good afternoon, everybody. It's really nice to meet you. Johanna and I work at the Democracy Collaborative, and we're what you call a think and do tank, and we're located in Cleveland, Ohio, and DC. So we put out a lot of research, and I put some things out on the table today which may have already left. But if you're ever interested in what we're doing, it's all online. You can read as much as you want. And we also work with communities of practice, so I lead our higher ed work and work with about 33 institutions who are intentionally applying an anchor mission. But just to begin, I wanted to get a show of hands. Who's heard the term anchor before? Okay, great. So this is right up your alley. We're going to just go over a brief definition. So anchor institutions are institutions that are rooted in that community. They're not going to leave. They're large economic drivers. So if we can tie our hiring, our purchasing, our investment, our land use strategies to anchors, we're going to have a sustainable economy which can build people's wealth. So I'm going to just talk real briefly that I'm going to cover what community wealth building is and kind of what an anchor mission is here. Real quickly in this slide, you can see what anchor institutions are. They're hospitals, they're city governments, they're utilities, museums, churches, community foundations. So these are all sorts of community partners that I hope you start thinking strategically about engaging, right? We're going to create an ecosystem that keeps wealth in the community, right? That dollar circulating longer. And we're also going to bring more economic opportunities by applying our institutional assets into high need, low income communities that have been traditionally denied those types of opportunities. And one way we do it at the Democracy Collaborative is thinking differently about ownership and control. A lot of people don't own their own business because they don't have that access to capital, right? So if we can have community-owned businesses like worker cooperatives, community land trusts, all of a sudden we're lowering the barrier of entry for people to start building equity in business, equity in a home, and more investing opportunities. Really briefly, the stats on worker cooperatives is that they tend to have 5% to 12% higher wages. Employees of employee-owned businesses have 2 times the amount of retirement savings, and that they're 25% less likely to be laid off. So these are strong, sustainable businesses that you can work with other anchors to create collective strategies around for uplifting. So now we're going to kind of turn on to the anchor mission. And this is really about how do you start thinking internally at your campuses about having an anchor mission. So show of hands, who here is in the sustainability office? Okay, who's in community engagement? Thank you. Who's a facility services person? Okay, a financial officer? Good. Who did I miss? Researchers. Faculty. Good. Students? Okay. So you can see in this framework that we're employing all of those people and all of those divisions. We work at breaking down silos, and we do that first off by collecting data. How do we know what we're doing is actually impacting the community? So we'll be going over that in the second panel a little bit more, but I wanted to introduce you to the framework here.
Thank you so much, and I think this really gets at the piece around economic resiliency being really key to climate justice and actually climate resiliency, because I think climate resiliency or climate vulnerability comes very much from political and economic enfranchisement, and so that's what the anchor mission can start to get at within the local community. And speaking of such a local community, Jenny, would you like to kind of describe what's happening at Northeastern a little bit?
Sure. So I'm a faculty member at Northeastern. I'm a professor of sustainability, science, and policy, and I'm also the director of the School of Public Policy and Urban Affairs. And Northeastern is an interesting, urban, large campus in the heart of Boston. And I've now worked at several universities, and it really is innovative in that as a university, it has transformed itself in the past 10, 15, 20 years from a commuter school, mostly vocational technological school, to an R1 research university. So it's kind of changed its profile. So it has a very responsive, dynamic, innovative culture. And it also is, with that has come, relationships with the city that have been tricky in terms of thinking about the community university relationship. And with the growth and so many more students, there has been a lot of displacement and gentrification of the local neighborhood, in Roxbury in particular, which is on one side of the campus. And so there's a lot of challenging issues. So I think partly what I can offer on this panel is like one example of one university with some of the challenges in the framework that we're discussing here. But I also wanted to highlight that one of the things that we're trying to do at Northeastern is really connect the research in sustainability and resilience and climate change with the teaching, with the campus and the community. And Northeastern is a leader internationally in experiential learning. So we feel like we have a particular emphasis and opportunity to really make some of these connections among all the different ways that an anchor institution can engage. And I think compared to some of the other anchor institutions that were mentioned that are in communities, universities and colleges have this unique responsibility and privilege and capacity to really think longer term than a lot of other organizations in communities. So and so when we think about climate change, that's a particular thing to consider. I'm gonna, later in the next session, I guess I'll talk a little bit more specifics about, Northeastern has just had a big internal investment in the Global Resilience Institute, so we're really focusing in on resilience as a cross-cutting theme across the whole university to engage people throughout in all different disciplines, and some other examples in our School of Public Policy and Urban Affairs. But I just wanted to mention in my own work, kind of thinking about this transformation and the just transition as really an opportunity for social justice and social change. So if you think about the renewable energy revolution that we're embarking on right now, going from fossil fuel-based system to renewable-based systems, we really have an opportunity here depending on how it's done. This doesn't necessarily happen, but as we pay attention to how this transition happens, we have the power to really redistribute power, literally and figuratively. There's opportunities, as we've talked about, for local jobs, economic and community empowerment, rectifying and enhancing racial equity issues, social, economic injustices. So in that sense, it's really a time for optimism and hope, and that's what the Green New Deal is really based on, is this connection between the changes that are happening anyway and the opportunity that's associated with that for advancing social justice in different ways. So as we all know, this is a disruption from the status quo, so resistance is inevitable, and I think that's what many of us, even in our institutions, in our communities and different power dynamics, there is resistance, and that's very understandable and predictable, I guess, in a sense. So I also just wanted to highlight, this was a piece that we just published highlighting some of our research that was published last week, really highlighting the point that it's not just climate change, why renewable energy and the move away from fossil fuels is so important. Climate change is often what the scientists talk about, and as we've heard, that's not what people wake up in the morning worrying about necessarily, climate change. So there are so many other reasons that we need to advance this transformation away from fossil fuels toward a renewable-based society, and there's so many other benefits that have nothing to do with climate change, that have to do with social justice and healthy communities and healthy people. And so I think the more we can emphasize these non-climate benefits, the more it connects with a broader group of communities and people. So I think with that, I can hand it over to.
Yeah, thank you so much, Jenny. And I think it's so right that fossil fuels are so much more than just what they're doing to climate. It's a lot more, and it's about how we transition off of them so that we can create resilient communities, not only to climate change, but to so many other things. So with that, I would love to see if there are questions in the room. I think we have time for like 5 minutes of questions. Is that right? Cool, great. Yeah. Well, I think there is a microphone coming your way with Barbara.
I didn't know you were going to do that.
Oh, yeah, that also works.
Okay. This is not specific to the state that we're in, but it could be, which is, how do you deal with commitments to social justice and a just transition when it can be perceived as partisan and political?
I can take that on.
Go for it.
We're okay with that. So we talk about the anchor mission being in the university's self-interest. If you go back to that definition, right, we're for mutual benefit. And so it's taking what the university is already doing, right? You're already purchasing things, you're already educating students. We're just asking that you do this all together, right? That you think really consciously, what is your local supply chain? We'll go in more into this, but can you uncouple contracts so that more small businesses can have access to those? So then the question comes up, is this having an impact? And that's where, measurement gets in. But it is showing that, yes, you don't have to give up saving money or making the best decision for the college by purchasing more things locally. So I want to offer that. As we go through this work, yes, continue being an institution, but also think about your ethical leadership. And is there more choices you can make that are going to improve the long-term health of that community? Because, as Jenny said, we also have a responsibility to our local community. You're public serving institutions, right? You're responsible for developing a workforce. You're responsible for developing civically engaged lifelong learners. And you're responsible for creating new knowledge. So we're asking you to do that, but do it in alignment with one another so you're not working across purposes.
I would just add that everything's political. If you do something, it's political. If you don't do something, it's political. Science is political. Climate change is political.
Yeah.
I don't think that's a reason. It doesn't, it depends on your framing, but everything is political, especially in this.
Can I just answer it really quickly, too? I agree with that, and I think the work that I've done on the just transition has been with investors, and investors always say,
they don't want to be political.
Right. And yet, if we look at what's going on in France with the Yellow Vest movement, some of the political debates in this country, I've spent a lot of time in Canada with the transition in Alberta. These are intense moments and transitions that have political ramifications. And if we don't recognize that and are sort of blind to it, it's going to set back whatever we hope to accomplish around climate. So I really feel like it has to be part of the work that we do, is to examine how the political ramifications and, frankly, the discourse is being impacted by not talking about jobs and impacts on communities. So I hope that we can actually dig into that dialogue and not sort of pull away from it.
Yeah, I've got a question. Does Just Transition contemplate an ongoing sort of two-way dialogue with the communities that are going to be affected and the populations, the workers that will be affected?
Yeah, that's the sort of premise, I think, of the work that's been taken on by government. So the Just Transition has been picked up by the Scottish government, the Canadian, the EU. And the premise really of it, at least in terms of looking at the workforce in the community, has been that there needs to be a broader stakeholder dialogue. And I think what we're here to talk with all of you about is how universities are part of that dialogue.
Yeah, I think that the community has to be front and center. And the reality is, in so many ways, they know what they need. They know how they're being impacted. And so they have to have a seat at that table as we're deciding the future of a community.
Hi, I guess two quick questions. One is if you could speak a little bit more towards any recommendations on how universities could be working with state governments specifically on some of these just transition issues, in addition to their local communities. And second, just building on the first question, it is a political issue, but has there been some thinking around a reframing of the message so that you can actually be talking in more conservative states or cities and still make a case for the kinds of actions that maybe they could support, but through a different frame?
Yeah, I think when it comes to framing, it's about jobs. in the end. It's about providing people like well-being and a job that gives them what their family needs. And if we're able to like provide and facilitate family sustaining wages through alternative mechanisms, I think that we can start to bridge gaps that might not actually be there in a lot of ways.
I don't think that you have to use the term just transition. It's already become sort of politicized. But if you look at specific communities that are facing the closure of a coal-fired plant, that's impacting taxpayers, ratepayers, workers, the community. There's state subsidies if they're making a transition. And so I think actually just getting in a room and having the discussion, I've seen it happen in places across the sort of political spectrum when it's not done around a kind of general what should or could happen, but around a specific situation that people are trying to work through together.
Yeah, I would just add for your question about framing, there's lots of different words that we can use. Resilience is one that is kind of more mainstream and doesn't, in some places it's actually a code word for climate change adaptation, right? And where you're not allowed to talk about climate change, but you can talk about resilience. And within that framing, justice issues can be integrated as well. But I was also going to just briefly touch on your question about engagement with political decision-making and state-level government in particular. There's all kinds of mechanisms for including course projects that are relevant to what's going on at the state legislature. In my own experience, it seems like many political leaders are looking for resources in their university and college communities and so there are opportunities for students to engage, faculty to engage, for the university itself to be a part of specific as well as more general initiatives of different kinds. So, that's kind of a vague answer, but I think there's lots of opportunities. Just trying to be creative and make some connections, personal connections about what people need and how a partnership or collaboration or contribution could be helpful.
Yeah, and I think that particularly in the second panel, hopefully we can get into mechanisms to leverage the power of anchor institutions in their community, be that with government, with utilities, with in a kind of a range of different scenarios. So hopefully we can dive deep into that a little bit too. Great. So I think that our time's up on Q&A, and we want to transition to you all talking about the Just Transition and what it means to you and in your campus. So I think we have a slide. That's is the next one? I think, yeah, no, it's back. There we go, broadening the lens. So the two, we'd love within your tables for you to start to discuss what the Just Transition means to you and what it'll look like in your campus.
Why don't you tell people how much time?
Alice, do we have an exact amount of time for this one too?
Set up 10, 15.
We've got 15 minutes, so we've got 15 minutes that we can let y'all do your thing in groups, and then we'll have a short report out. Cool. I think we have enough time for just a couple of report outs from the tables. Is anyone raring to go and ready to give a 30-second spiel on what you talked about? Wonderful. Ooh, my group.
Hi, I'm Laura with the Philadelphia Energy Authority, and I'll share maybe 3 highlights. One was that Central Community College from Nebraska, I'm sorry, you said not Iowa, I'm so sorry, from Nebraska has established a new energy technologies program in renewable energy, training people to join the workforce. And we also learned about a program in Maryland that's basically evaluating the quality of clean energy jobs that are being created to make sure they're well-paying. And so we were discussing some of the tension around which union solar installation jobs fall under and whether that makes solar too expensive to make it make sense. And then I was sharing about my work in Philadelphia around a job creation initiative called the Philadelphia Energy Campaign, which is all about creating clean energy jobs in the city. And then I also mentioned a project I'm involved with called Serenity Solar, which is based out of Swarthmore College in Philadelphia, working with a low-income community to support residents there to start a worker-owned solar cooperative. So many models came up in our discussion.
Are there any I think we're running a little short on time, so one other table willing to step up to the plate? Raring.
That's a no.
Yeah, well, let's go on
Okay.
then. Great. Awesome.
Where's Alice?
Who else?
So I know that at this part of the panel, you wanted to drop into a second conversation. Alice is rapidly on her way to get more into the how-to, because we were just trying to get people comfortable with the what. Perfect. I was going to start singing, Alice.
We spared everybody that moment. Okay, so back at this angle, is just to give you a framework so that you've had the conversation now about what it might look like on your campus, and this is to give you some ideas about steps, a framework so that you could start to make first steps plans. So I'm going to turn it over first to Emily and Johanna, both who are from the Democracy Collaborative, to tell us about what anchor mission strategies they use to help advance the just transition and to provide some examples.
Great. Yeah. So again, I'm going to start with how we do work with the universities I work with. It starts by defining local. That's an important part of our work. In this slide, you see that 8 miles separates 20 years in life expectancy. And if we were to look at the life expectancy according to neighborhoods of color versus white neighborhoods, it's African American neighborhoods in this case that have 20 years less life expectancy than the affluent white communities in the suburbs. So when I work with universities, the first question is to go back to your universities and define what local is. Local should be a community that you want to have a long-term interest in. And the reason for that is we're seeing effects of gentrification, right? So local no longer has to mean the community just right around your campus. It can be the community that you want to see uplifted, right? So that's the first thing, and it's a discussion. And I really liked what someone at our table said. The Democracy Collaborative has a framework, and we bring it to you. Your campus will decide the definitions and the framing that makes sense to you. So of course, we love census track, right? You're going to be able to show an impact on those communities. The lower unit of measuring you can do. Zip code is good. I also work with universities where you're tracking metro level and county. The next part of this process is to get started. Start tracking the data with the people in the room that were on that large circle, right? So people from the procurement office, the hiring office, the sustainability, the community engagement, get deans there, communications, and you all have to figure out how to track this measure. And the exciting thing about doing that, one conversation I loved, is one of the measures is a living wage. And the procurement officer came to that conversation not really knowing what a living wage was or why it was important. And because they started talking with the community engagement staff, who also had a sociology degree, they started talking about why is living wage important. And the procurement officer left that meeting saying, I want everyone at the college to have a living wage, right? So there's some good teaching you can do to one another from your area of expertise that are gonna get you to that common goal. So as you start tracking the Anchor dashboard data, you're going to start having those conversations. We hope those conversations build, right, to where we're thinking about our other Anchor partners and community-based organizations that can help us along on this collective impact goal. So I'm gonna keep rolling. We're focusing on 4 areas of the Anchor dashboard today. It's over 100 measures, so we're not gonna get up there all in one foul swoop. But Johanna and I are gonna walk through some examples together. The first one is on community-engaged anchor institutions. And just to kind of help orient you to the charts, The institutional effort category is kind of your baseline data, right? It's what is your campus currently doing? The institutional impact category is what steps can you take, what intervention can you design that you can then see if you've made progress on that baseline data point. And then the community outcome is the external outcome we hope your community is seeing from the work you're doing. So Johanna, you're going to focus on the University Partnership Center and kind of thinking about collective impact goals.
Yeah, absolutely. So the one that I wanted to bring up here is based in Florida. So Florida obviously is being pummeled by more and more hurricanes. And that means that the lights are going out more often, and that mostly can most adversely impact lower income communities. So the University of Florida Solar Energy Center actually is coordinating with the Department of Energy, the Florida state government, and local school districts to implement microgrids, which are things, a part that can operate within the grid, but it can also operate independently with a combination of solar and batteries, so it can actually operate as an emergency center when it is needed. And so what they've done is implemented these systems all across Florida in communities on the tops of local schools, so elementary and high schools, integrating at the same time curriculum that teaches young students about the opportunities of renewable energy, while also being a key place where folks can go in moments where there are disasters and when they need a place for shelter.
Great, and one reason I really like this, right? You have anchors in local governments, schools, utilities, so you're all working out towards this for a collective goal. We see this showing up more and more. Newark, New Jersey has this program where they're hiring 2,000 new people by 2020. There's 11 anchors working on this. They've each taken a part of that hiring goal so that they can achieve it together. And it was state mandated by the mayor, it was mandated by the mayor's office. So thank you for that example. The next one is place-based investments, and we're hoping you go beyond ESG here. We really hope to find that how you're impacting your local community with place-based investments. How many people know what a CDFI is? Okay, so I'm going to just explain it really quickly. It's a mission-driven community economic, so it stands for Community Development Financial Institution, and they're mission-driven to serve low-income and moderate-income neighborhoods. So if you can partner with CDFIs and local banks, that's an easy way for money to stay circulating in the community for longer. One example I like about that is the University of Chicago. Back in 2012, worked with students to invest $1 million into local banks, 4 local banks. And they found that 4 years later, that money had stayed in the community at 74 times the amount had they gone with a national bank. So they leveraged their lending power just by investing into local banks.
And we know that Vonda is also has a lot to say about this, so we'll leave most of the juicy stuff to her. But we're going to move on to another.
Yeah, so local purchasing, and we also kind of got into this at my table too. So being able to hire more minority owned supplies, owners, women, minority-owned businesses. You can do that by starting to think about how you're contracting. So are there ways that you can change the RFP, the bidding process, through preferred purchasing points, by unbundling contracts? I think an easy way to start doing this is do a procurement assessment. What are you spending on now? Where is that business located? So that's a good point. Where is it located in terms of where it says it's located, and where is it physically located? And is that in your geographic area that you designated? So Johanna, do you want to kind of share an example about that?
Yeah, so University City District is this area in West Philly where essentially all these anchor institutions are packed into this one area. And so they've started to take collective action together. But one of the things that they realized is that there was this disproportionate effect where they were doing economically quite well, but 1 in 3 West Philadelphians is under the poverty line. And so they were wondering how they can bridge that gap through hiring and procurement. So that wasn't the case in the same way anymore. And so they started this West Philly Skills Initiative where they were creating a pipeline for that. And out of that came Green City Works, which implements green infrastructure around University City District through contracts with the anchor institution. And this social enterprise, so it's a nonprofit fee-for-service entity, in particular helps folks that have barriers to entry when it comes to jobs. For instance, they may have previously been incarcerated, they're underemployed. And this provides them the opportunity, and as I was talking with the manager of Green City Works, he says that it was anchors that gave them a chance, and that is why they have been able to go across a larger part of the city and expand their business pretty significantly, which helps employ local folks.
I also have 2 policy recommendations for purchasing local. A lot of times it's hard to decouple your contracts because you're a state system, so that is something we're addressing through the work we're doing. It's slow moving, but we've had a couple small wins. The other thing is I want people to think about at the city level, citywide level, maybe at even the state level, is there a community benefits agreement that can be put into place so that not with every project you're kind of having to fight this same battle, but you're coming together with other anchors saying, listen, we're gonna do more minority purchasing. If a business is worker owned, that's a preferred purchasing point. Here's how we're gonna hire more locally when businesses wanna come and develop with us. The last thing we kind of discussed is the limited pollution and greenhouse gas emissions that are part of contracting and development bids. If the contractor goes over that bid, is there a carbon tax that we can put upon them as sort of a reparations that can go back to impacted communities? So that's something that as you continue to develop your partnerships with other anchors and place-based actors, think about the policy levers that you can take together that will be able to create new standards for how you do business in your whole community. So we're on to healthy residents and environments. So unfortunately, we do track asthma, infant mortality, obesity rates as part of the anchor dashboard. There is a lot of evidence that focus on local is so needed to show, are we having healthy outcomes for residents that are living there? So Johanna, you've done a lot of work on what are ways that the university can invest to improve the built environment.
Yeah, so this is the one I'm most excited to share with you all because I think it's really engaging and shows a totally cool model. I've heard a lot of people talking about how they're investing in renewable energy, and Cooperative Energy Futures is this member-owned entity that kind of acts as the manager between all of these entities that are coming together for community solar. And one of the key things that they're doing in order to allow low-income residents to have access to community solar, since they have the highest rates of energy poverty, and give them, because they need the most access to lowering their energy bills, is they will utilize anchor tenants. So that's churches, that's universities. It's even in one place, it's in the city of Edina in Minnesota, they're implementing this where the anchor tenant will say, we're gonna take 40 to 70% of the solar installation, and then that's going to cover the upfront costs of the LMI residents that are also going to be a part of this community solar install. And that gets rid of upfront costs, and it also will stop things like credit scores that often are utilized in renewable energy installs. And so what the Cooperative Energy Futures has done is brought together both the university and any anchor institution and lower income community members and put them together in ownership of their energy future. And the other thing that I think is so key here is that they've also required their installers to have particular workforce development goals. So they have to provide pathways and particularly have local and people of color who are doing the installs. And this I think is really, really key because right now the solar industry is incredibly white in the installation, and we need to shift so that we have a more diverse workforce that's entering into this space of solar.
Yeah, so that's a great point to kind of end on. As you know, the Anchor Dashboard has many metrics, hiring is one of them. But the point you raised about students or the need to have a more diversified workforce, I have another story with a university I worked with. They were doing a community project where they wanted to address the infrastructure within people's houses and update their water and piping. They were looking for a landscape architect of color, right? And they looked within a 3-county area of their state and they couldn't find one landscape architect of color. And so I think that's something we need to continue to do as we do this work, is to think about who are we engaging in classes and how can we do a better job at that. I think my final ask to you at this point is, when you think about engaging your community, that's happening in the sustainability office, it's happening many different places across campus. I would encourage you to reach out to your community engagement officer. I tend to work mostly with community engagement officers, and so they're knee-deep in this work and can be an ally to you as you move forward. So if you need more help connecting with them, feel free to talk to them. Chances are I might know them. So thanks, that's our bit.
Great. So we haven't really gotten a chance to talk about endowments and how they might play into this, and that's one aspect of university. So Fonda, I'm wondering if you can tell us a little bit about how they can, how endowments can invest towards a just transition.
Sure. I think I'll be brief because I didn't see that many hands that went up when Emily asked the question about who was part of either a trustee or the endowment at your university, or if you see them out in the corridors, you can send them to me afterwards. But I'll give you sort of a sketch of what I've been working on. So I spent about 15 years working in the labor movement, and my role there was to work with our pension funds. So the public pension funds and Taft-Hartley funds in the US are made up of workers' deferred savings. And our role was really to think about how we could steer them towards responsible investing, and that covered a whole range of issues, including shareholder engagement. And so I found myself over the last number of years working around a lot of climate issues and trying to look at climate risk and what the role of the pension fund was in addressing climate. And about a year and a half ago, I met a colleague of mine who was then at the UN Environmental Program, the Inquiry into a Sustainable Financial Future. And he and I were complaining about our political landscape, back to politics. And I was discouraged post the election in 2016 by the movement we were making backwards on our commitment to climate goals. And he's British and based in London. He was doing his own fair amount of complaining about Brexit. And again, sort of a reversal of some of the things that he had been working towards. And so we realized that the work that we were doing as investors around climate was missing this huge part, and that is, what are the impacts, as I mentioned before, on workers and communities? So the project that we've taken up, his name is Nick Robbins, he's now based at LSE at the Grantham Institute, is really to look at what's the role of investors in the just transition, and do we have a role? So we did a paper, that's what we do at universities now, at least I do. You can find it, just to look at making a case, should we be involved? And then what we released in December is probably a more useful report to the endowments in the room, and that is a guide for investors to take action. And if you can't find it on the web, I can make sure that it's available to you. Just come and see me afterwards. And so essentially what we did is we looked at the framework of endowments and pension funds and tried to think about not reinventing the wheel, like how do we sort of turn our whole portfolio over, but how do we include the just transition into what we're already doing? So really briefly, We looked at a couple, just as a couple of examples, how do we think about the just transition in our strategy and in our policy documents? And so just to give you an example of a fund that has done that, not an endowment fund, but a private sector pension fund in France called Ircantec, they actually took their policy and they said, you know, we're responsible not just for this generation of retirees, but we're also responsible for the next couple of generations, and we need to have sort of a parity of interests. And so that means we need to look at the climate and the economic development of the community that we're in. And so that was their way to include the just transition into their policy statements. Again, I can share that statement with you if you're interested. And then we looked at how we do our asset allocation and how do we invest in things that could promote a just transition. So this is sort of the opportunity side of investing in the new economy. And an example there is the Danish pension funds who've developed a huge program around infrastructure investing and actually sort of start from a framework of how do we, and they're doing a lot on wind, how do we work with local trade unions and worker organizations to do the training that's needed to build out a workforce to build the wind turbines? And so they're not starting from a perspective that there's a cost we need to manage around labor, but here's an opportunity for us to build in new skills and new training for workers in this sort of new economy. And then the final example I'll give is around engagement. So a lot of the work that pension funds, endowments, foundations do is as their role as shareholders, how do we engage with companies around climate issues? And so it was mentioned actually earlier in one of the sessions, a group that's called Climate Action 100+. And so this is an effort by global investors to engage on climate collectively, build more power. Oh, there's Tim Smith. Tim mentioned it before. You can talk more with him about it. But we're partnered our project with two organizations, the Principles for Responsible Investment and the International Trade Union Confederation. And so this gives us the ability to work with PRI signatories as well as trade unions on how we can think about engaging with companies around the just transition. And the Climate Action 100+ is one of the vehicles that we're hoping to do that in. So as we're going and talking to companies about how they're going to transition their operations or their mix, their capacity to a lower carbon, how do we think about the impacts that that's going to have on the workforce in whatever sector that is, within utilities or nuclear? There's all sorts of examples of companies that are starting to think long term, and then how are they thinking long term also about their workforce? And then for companies that are based in communities where all the jobs are in one place, it has a huge impact on the community if that company folds or if they convert to something else. So I feel like that's the opportunity for investors to go in and say, we care about those issues. So both of these guides and discussion papers are online if people are interested in learning more, or I'm happy to take questions afterwards.
So it'd be great if, Jenny, you could talk a little bit about, you said you could be the representative of some of the framework discussion that just happened and where your challenges are at Northeastern and like ways you've overcome them or the successes and challenges.
So I think if we think about how universities can engage in the just transition, you can kind of think about these different areas, right? The kind of main roles that universities and colleges, higher ed, teaching is a fundamental one, right? So we can all integrate some of these concepts into our teaching, into the curriculum. The table over here was talking about energy programs. And increasingly there's interest in people jobs in energy. And a lot of universities and colleges, conventionally in higher ed, it's not clear what discipline, where in the university you should go if you want to get into the energy sector. So there's some new programs, energy minors, energy majors, energy masters programs, different kinds of initiatives developing. And I just want to give a plug for the National Council for Science and Environment has a community of practice focused on energy education. And that's a network that offers resources for anybody who is working on developing curriculum in energy education. So that's just one one piece. So that's in the teaching and curriculum. That's kind of a core thing that we think about. But I just wanted to go through a few examples of other ways that universities can engage on these issues. And I think one of the roles of universities in terms of that connects kind of the research, the campus community, is to be a convening space. And many of us, can offer our campus as a place for people to come and talk about some of these difficult issues. And so, for example, at Northeastern in October, we had a public forum on closing the gaps in a just city, racial and economic inequities in transportation. We actually had our newly elected Congresswoman, Ayanna Pressley, come to campus. And she had actually, her campaign video, one of her promotional videos was actually about her riding the #1 bus in Boston that goes from the most economically disadvantaged community all the way through Harvard and MIT up into Cambridge, and showing this discrepancy in our city. And so that's another obvious role that we all can play in terms of convening community to come and talk about some of these issues. I also wanted to mention this initiative at Northeastern focused on resilience research. And resilience research, we have established this Global Resilience Institute at Northeastern, and the idea here is not just climate resilience, but disruptions of all kinds. We're actually in a turbulent time in humanity, and strengthening resilience is really about reducing vulnerabilities in communities, and preparing for, adapting to, and learning from disruptions of all kinds. And that's not just emergency management and sudden abrupt disruptions, but also slowly emerging disruptions like sea level rise or growing inequality is in and of itself a disruption in society. So thinking about resilience at multiple scales is also a key thing. We can think about individual resilience. The slides aren't showing right now, but that's fine. Individual resilience, community resilience, systems resilience, infrastructure resilience. There are many ways that are kind of cross-cutting and interdisciplinary. And at Northeastern, we have 9 different colleges. And our Global Resilience Institute now has faculty affiliates from 102 faculty affiliates from all 9 colleges. So the resilience theme resonates across disciplines, right? Across the university. And it really has enabled us to really catalyze engaged research projects that are very interdisciplinary, bringing people together that don't necessarily in a big campus with a lot going on talk to each other with the focus on resilience. And so we have a wide breadth of engaged, impactful research, resilience research, and we have seed grants, so we offer support for these collaborative research projects. So that's been exciting to kind of be involved with. I wanted to end with an example that actually was mentioned earlier in a couple of the different sessions about these opportunity zones, which is a tax advantage new program with the new tax law, and this is the whole island of Puerto Rico is considered an opportunity zone. And throughout the country, there are over 8,000 of these opportunity zones. And it's a tax incentive program with an estimated $100 billion of private investment into these low-income urban and rural communities nationwide. And one of the things we're thinking about at Northeastern, we're actually in an opportunity zone in part of the Northeastern campus is, we're thinking about what is the role of universities in helping communities steer these investments in ways that do actually strengthen resilience and reduce vulnerabilities rather than having predatory kind of investments come in and people trying to make money on poor communities, which easily could happen because there's very little guidance on how these investments are going to happen. So what we've been trying to do is acknowledge kind of the lack of impact incentives, a lack of oversight in this national program. There's very little local control, and if states and cities and communities don't pay attention, investments can come in and not necessarily help the community. So paying attention to gentrification and displacement, and how this fits with other tax incentives that are also in place. So the interesting thing about the opportunity zones is that there are at least 1,400 colleges and universities in opportunity zones around the country. So there is a role for colleges and universities to be aware of this, thinking about how to engage with communities in a supportive role, to try to help facilitate this potential of potential real uptick in investment in some of these places. So I think that's the main thing that I wanted to mention, and I think what we're still in the development phase, kind of thinking about how our university, Northeastern in particular, how can we engage to guide these responsible, resilient opportunity zone investments, and it involves understanding the community's resilience needs and assessing the opportunities for the communities, and then optimizing that value for the investor and the community in an intersecting role. So we see potentially us as university trying to facilitate some of these conversations. So I think that.
Great. Thank you. We're ready to open up to questions, I think, right?
Definitely.
So ready to take your questions on opportunity zones or any of the other things that we mentioned around anchor frameworks?
Yeah, just a comment and then a question on the opportunity zones. I think an area that universities could get involved is that you're seeing in the investment world that the funds that are getting put together first off are by global diversified real estate managers that don't have any expertise in community development. And the community development financial institutions don't necessarily have the expertise in putting together a fund structure that's easily accessible. So helping them put together a fund that can be accessed at the scale and with the pipeline is something maybe universities could help with. Question on a non-intuitive aspect of kind of just transition. You know, I actually think that the military is sometimes pretty forward-thinking on this aspect of resiliency. The term that they use in reference to climate change is a threat multiplier, which I was thinking of when you were talking about resiliency at all scales. So, you know, not necessarily an intuitive collaboration source, but what sort of leverage of that very hard power interpretation of resiliency might we be able to take?
Yeah, I think there's a lot to be learned and collaboration with the military. At Northeastern, we have a focus on security, sustainability, and health. And then the resilience theme is kind of integrative. So there's several of my colleagues are very explicitly making that connection. And I think there's definitely interest at the federal level to make some of these connections and learn from what the military has done and apply it in other places in the federal government and in other entities. So yeah, I think it's a great point, and I think there's definitely lots of connections there.
Yeah, and just on that point, there's a nonprofit that just started recently called Peace Rising that is trying to model through GPS and like ArcGIS where most likely there is the potential for conflict due to climate change. And so if we can triangulate that now, we can potentially identify how we can make steps to create resiliency so that it doesn't lead to conflict, and how we can actually create communities that are ready and resilient and aren't feeling these the issues of water scarcity and economic pain, and so that we can stop that earlier.
And I'll also weigh in, I think, right, universities tech transfer your research and development. A lot of research, one capacity, is going towards, is being acknowledged and noticed and used by the military, right? And they are some of the earlier adopters around green technology. So I think, back to the point made earlier today, is more research needs to be done, right? more research needs to be done, and that research is going to be used to continue to grow our economy, to continue to get things to market and be used by the military. I think we would want to just, be intentional about what this is for, and how do we continue to build mechanisms to make sure that communities of color and those most marginalized are centered in whatever that technology develops into and how it's used.
Other questions?
Hi, this may take us down a different path, so I don't know. As I'm listening to this, I'm thinking to some of the readings I've done on the transition over a number of years from things being public goods to private goods, things being public responsibilities to private responsibilities. And in particular, if you think about education, public good, now we oftentimes think of it as a private good, and so on. But I'm wondering how much we have to push these initiatives you're talking about, all of which I think are great, how much we need to take them on in the private capacity versus how much we need to push them back into the public realm. What role does government have in these things that we're in some way either trying to mitigate or somehow offset by having other institutions, anchor institutions, step into the process?
Yeah, I can speak to that a little bit. So I investigate certain public goods that are in kind of investor-owned hands. So I do a lot of work on utilities and potential transfer to like public hands and ownership structures generally. And so I think that you do bring up a good point that we do need to ensure that things, particularly now, that stay in the public good or transfer back to public good. And so what are the mechanisms that we can create new models of ownership so that it actually is achieving that goal? Because I think even in the government, what you're seeing right now is that we don't have democratized systems often. And so that means the communities that we're trying to get at with the just transition don't have access to those decision-making powers. And so I think anchor institutions can, model in many ways like what it means to have a worker at the table, and like what it means to have a community member at the table that then can be applied in all these other places. And personally, I have worked a lot on kind of like where are these places like community ownership that we can move and try like work on our democracy in so many ways so that we can ensure that we're providing a public good.
So I agree. I think there's been a lot of disinvestment from the public good. We've seen I watched it for the last 10 years. In my neighborhood, the public library is in jeopardy. And it was something that was seen as part of the community. What do we do without it, right? And you could probably everyone could come up with lots of examples of things that we saw as a public good that are now, at risk. So what's the role of the university in that? And I think about that from the perspective of the endowments and what's the role of investors in that. And I feel like there's a partnership that has to take place to sort of create that balance. And right now, I'm seeing in some of the circles that I'm in, this expectation that the private sector is going to take care of the problems and looking for solutions that are based on sort of a market strategy. And it makes me nervous. And I feel like if we could have a conversation where, again, to the convening power of the university, where we can actually talk about this. And just one example of what I saw recently take place, I was in the UK, in Yorkshire, which is the home of the Industrial Revolution, a sector or a region that's been, really traumatized, decimated over the last number of decades as they've seen the sort of all the industries flee or change or close up. And so the poverty rates and inequality is huge. So I was in Leeds, and the University of Leeds has played a huge role in bringing together all the stakeholders around the table to start new climate initiatives. And so it includes government. They're working with the City Council of Leeds, the University of Leeds, then the trade unions, NGOs. And I heard a presentation by the professor from the university who's kind of heading this up. And he sort of talked about all the stakeholder groups, including something he called pressure groups. His name is Andy Colson. I was like, Andy, what are pressure groups? Well, you know, you can kind of imagine what they are, and yet they're kind of leaning into that. So I feel like this is a role that we could play about, you know, in his mind, the privatization has happened of a lot of utilities and infrastructure in the UK, but they now are at a moment where they need to figure out a better balance because it hasn't worked for the community in Yorkshire. So I think that's an inspiring example of what universities could do, and that is to sort of dig into this debate about what's the public good and what's the role of the private sector. I don't think that there's an easy answer to that, but I think it's a great conversation for us to have.
And I'll just jump out. I know we don't have much time, but we also have done a little bit of work in the UK, and there's this municipality called Preston, and so we've done a lot of work on what's called the Preston model, which is a lot of localized procurement. Preston was similarly kind of a big part of the Industrial Revolution, but then all the companies left when it was no longer economically viable. And so they were left like constantly and looking for more. In 2008, the same thing happened to them, that they just were not getting the jobs. And so the municipality has shifted a lot of its procurement to the local community so that local businesses were providing the things that their community needed, in addition to municipalizing the local electric utility, so they had more agency in pushing towards 100% renewable energy. So they're going through that process right now and thinking about the relationships between worker co-ops, universities, and municipalities in how they work together to democratize their economy writ large.
I just have two kind of provocative things to say about the public-private question, and then I know we might want to open it up. One is about another component is not just public sector versus private sector, but we have, with the concentration of wealth among a very, very few, it's actually private philanthropy that dictates a lot of what happens. And that is not democratic at all. And we've gotten to the point where even our most vulnerable communities rely on like donations and philanthropy. And even if you think about legal profession, it's mandated that all law firms have to do pro bono work, right, for people who can't afford it. And so like we've institutionalized like this private donations, and it's critical. We can't do without it at this point. So that's part of the public-private shift that we've seen. So that's problematic on some level. The other thing I was just going to say about public-private, when you think about universities and colleges themselves, obviously, you know, that's a whole different conversation about the access issues. And many of our universities, especially our private universities that are hard, not accessible to everybody, we are actually perpetuating inequalities by rubber stamping those who have the fancy degrees and the people who don't get the fancy degrees, and we're moving farther from a socially just society where an education is supposed to be, you know, equalizer, right? And if you think about that, even with our public schools, we're going in the wrong direction with a lot of our public investments that are making the just transition even harder. So I just wanted to throw that out as, you know, the role of higher education or education in general is also a divider. I mean, it has potential to if we are able to bring it back, but it's also contributing to inequities.
So are there any other questions in the room? I have one, if I may. So I've just finished spending a year facilitating a conversation in Boston where there were women with white privilege who were controlling an institution in a minority community. And they wanted to do a community engagement issue. So we spent a whole year in conversation. And as a facilitator, it was fascinating watching how that conversation did and didn't take place, because there were all kinds of issues of privilege and how we as the educated white women would jump in and fix it. And we weren't doing things with, we were doing things for. So I can imagine that whether you're having a conversation across class or whether you're having a conversation across race, what I heard in common with all of you is it was about getting local with the community and building these partnerships. And I'm just wondering where that work is happening. How are you having those conversations, and how we're dealing with issues of privilege and education to really open up those lines of communication with the community? And if that is that structurally built into the work that you're doing? Because I'm hearing it over and over again that we want to have those conversations. Having them well seems to be critical. So.
Yeah. So the work I do involves tracking quantitative data as well as qualitative. So we have surveys, we have tools to do surveys with community partners and community residents. As one of the institutions was setting their goal, they wanted to set the goal with the community, and they approached the community. It's a community-based organization, a literacy center where they know a lot of people are already gathering. And they said, okay, what economic development would you like to see in this neighborhood? And there was just the conversation didn't go anywhere. There was just some blinking. And that's when they realized, okay, we're gonna even have to take a step back, where we start having study circles on what is economic development, and how do I, as someone who's not maybe used that term ever, what role do I play in economic development? And so kind of using a popular education method to begin socializing the term with the community so they could start thinking about the assets that they have and what they might like to see in their community.
I would just give one example. At Northeastern in the School of Public Policy and Urban Affairs, we have an open classroom, which is literally a class that meets every Wednesday evenings. And the community, it's open, anyone can come. If any of you are in Boston, you're welcome to come anytime. And one of the things we're going to be doing even more of is planning the agenda for that open classroom with community participation. So that's just one mechanism, but there are lots of different ways.
So I'll just mention two really quick. One is I've worked with a lot of fiduciaries and trustees over the years, and there's this expectation that they should just shut up and do what the investment managers tell them to do. It's said much nicer than that. Sort of like, don't worry about your fiduciary duty, we'll take care of it for you. And so we actually started a convening at the Harvard Kennedy School with trustees to think about how they could be the leaders as opposed to the recipients. Again, still people with privilege, but for the most part, these are workers, school bus drivers, social workers for the state, who are fiduciaries of funds, who are often sort of dismissed because they don't know finance, but actually have a lot of skills that they can contribute to the management of the money. And after 2008, we learned that sometimes being an expert doesn't really serve you so well in the finance sector. And then the other example is much more local. I do a lot of work in the Hudson Valley in New York, and there's a very successful farm that found it was making a lot of money off of their sauerkraut business. Funny enough, a little thing in the basement of one of the buildings, and so they decided to sort of move it out and start a whole company around sauerkraut, and had a whole bunch of firms that came and wanted to invest in them, including venture capital firms. And they said no, the terms were too strict. They wanted to actually be able to direct the business how they wanted to. And so again, I feel like it's how do people take ownership of their skills and their expertise in whatever room that they're in, and not be cowed by folks who have privilege or positional power or money or whatever it would be. And then how do the people who are in those positions of privilege shut up, right? Just sort of sit back and say, you know what? I don't have the answers. I really want to hear from you. Can we have those kind of dialogues that I think would look very different, at least in the finance sector, than what we have right now?
Yeah, and just one last thing. I think you talked about provocative partners potentially in leads, and I think that sometimes the community is already trying to speak with you. You just have to listen, and allowing them into the room, what that may have been closed off to them, even if they are campaigning, and it might feel provocative. To have that conversation could build bridges and try to fill that gap.
Thank you.